I'm so excited that we could get to introduce Morag Martindale to speak this morning. After a career as a teacher and educator, in 2006, Morag co-founded Chrysalis Professional Development to provide training and support on child and adolescent behaviour. Morag now works with carers, teachers and social workers, as well as many other organisations and groups right across Scotland. And I can tell you from personal experience that if you ask foster carers, or at least in Edinburgh, if you ask foster carers what is the most useful and practical training for looking after vulnerable young people, they pretty much always recommend Morag's Chrysalis courses.
Oh.
This morning, Morag is going to talk about self-regulation, which is the ability that we all have to varying degrees to monitor and manage our internal life, our thoughts, our feelings and emotions. This concept and the ways that neglected or mistreated young brains can fail to develop these skills fully, essential to the training programs that Morag runs. And this really opens up new approaches and new insights to children whose behaviours can be sometimes quite worrying. What Morag teaches and what she's going to talk about today, I think, gives fresh insight on how our brains work and develop, and what we can do ourselves to be more resilient in the face of challenges and obstacles, which makes her obviously the perfect speaker for our theme this month. But I think more importantly, Morag really challenges a lot of the assumptions that we make about behaviour management and the needs of so-called difficult young people, and what we can do as a society to support them. So it's my absolute pleasure to pass the Zoom mic over to Morag Martindale.
Hi, thanks, Matt. Great. This is such an exciting experience for me. I'm meeting with people virtually who are just totally different to the folks that I normally work with. So it's such an exciting start to the day for me. So I hope not to let you down along those lines. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about me, and then I will take you through this business of self-regulation, and hopefully, as much as time allows, I'll leave you with something that you'll find useful, thought-provoking, etc. So let me just now share the screen with you, and fingers crossed that this works as it did earlier. I'm sure someone will let me know, give me a thumbs up. Oh, excellent, jolly good. Right, oops, daisies. Okay, so before I embark on the theme of the morning, I thought it would be useful for you just to learn a little bit more about me. And as Matt said, my career started a very long time ago now. I trained as a teacher, and I spent the first 2 years of my career working in a rural school in Aberdeenshire, where I thought I had met a range of challenging children, and I prided myself in being able to deal with these challenges effectively and efficiently and so on. So I was quite the thing with my job at that point. Then we moved to Edinburgh, and I had to take supply work in an inner city type school where there were lots of social pressures, a lot of disadvantages in the area. And that was a very new experience for me. And I had to embark on trying to make things work for a different type of youngster completely. And by golly, that was a bit of a shock. So I'm afraid that for the first couple of weeks, I went home every night and wept and said, no matter how much we need the money, I just can't go back there. And that persisted for the first little while until something kind of turned in me. And I'm afraid it wasn't anything very noble. It was more a case of, right, you wee sods, there has to be a way to make this work somehow. So I dug in, I learned from colleagues around me, and far from feeling that I was fighting a losing battle with these youngsters, I began to get really connected to them, really interested in them. I began to worry about them. I also had my first experience of what it must be like for children who experience sudden transitions in their lives, because we had a children's home in the area where children could be replaced overnight and still turn up for school the next day. So all in all, that was where my interest in children who experience levels of social, emotional and behavioural needs first started. And it's become a lifelong interest for me, and that has continued. So my career took me from that area. We moved around Scotland a bit, I worked in primary settings, secondary, I worked in residential education. I did a bit of work in secure provision for a while, until eventually I ended up as manager of a big team of staff who were all working to support children and young people with behavioural needs, both in schools and in the communities. So life sort of jiggled along quite nicely for me. Loved what I was doing. I did more and more staff development at that time. I did some work with the government in putting together training programs and so on. Then along came an event which really forced me to dig deep, to think deeply, and perhaps draw on my resilience at the time. The local authority I was working for at that time decided to bring in training in physical handling, restraining, etc. for children and young people. And this training was to be rolled out for all staff in mainstream settings, which meant that my team of staff also had to be trained along these lines. Now, I was very uncomfortable with this. I had seen examples of adults holding and restraining children in different settings over my career. And I also had used it as a focus of study when I was doing my own postgrad work. So I knew that there were worrying outcomes of this way of thinking of managing children's behaviour. So in a nutshell, and to cut the story short, I resisted for as long as I could, but pressure was mounting on me until it came to the point that I was invited along to sit at the side and watch some of this training taking place, in the hope that that would subdue my worries and make me more comfortable with being trained. So I remember the morning very well, because I sat at the side of this room in my jogging trousers and trainers, expecting to take part in the afternoon. And far from thinking, yes, this isn't just what I thought it was, I made the decision there that I had to go in a different direction. This, I could never be trained in this, and nor could I bring along a staff team to that sort of training either. So, long story again, but from there, myself and a colleague who shared my thoughts decided basically to hold hands, jump off the edge of the cliff, resign from our well-paid, well-pensioned, secure jobs, and to start working independently, really promoting a different approach, a different style of thinking to managing children and their worrying, troubling behaviours and so on. Because also at the time I was learning more and more about this self-regulation approach, developing brains, etc. A lot of new neuroscience was coming to the fore, which hadn't been around when I did my initial teacher training. So that was very embedded in my practice as it was, and I used that as the springboard to then go forward. So that has been the case for the last number of years, as Matt said, and the work takes me all over the place. I love it. I believe in it with a passion, and I hope, as I say, that I can give you a flavour of what this is all about. So actually, just before I click on to the slides here, just to add a little postscript to my story of me watching the training that morning. The training was being undertaken by two senior members of staff, male, female, who were demonstrating holds, etc. And after I had parted company from the local authority, I did hear, don't pass this around, I did hear that they both left their spouses and their families and set off into the twilight as a newly formed couple. So I always suspected that one of the negative and worrying outcomes for children and young people can be that if they become accustomed to physical holding and touch as the outcome of an episode, then there's a danger that it can be sought for sexualized reasons down the line. So I'll leave it for you to think through. However, okay, let's get on to what we're here for this morning. So the title of the course is Improving Self-Regulation in Order to Improve Outcomes. Now, for this to make real sense for you, I need to take you into my world of behaviour and just set some of our thinking in different frameworks. So the slide that I hope you can see in front of you there is a slide which shows the very traditional way of thinking around managing behaviour. Very simple to get your heads around. It's the ABC of behaviour. And the way it's set out here really describes the model which probably most of us were brought up around. The A stands for the antecedent, which is just anything that comes before behaviour that may contribute to it, may lead up to it. The B in the middle, clearly the behaviour, and the C following the behaviour stands for the consequences. So traditionally, and really based back in Victorian times, we've had a belief that the most effective way to eliminate unwanted behaviours in children and young people is to think out what we do following those behaviours. Similarly, if we want to increase the kind of behaviours we all like to see in children, then we have consequences to use for that too. So relying on consequences may allow us to plan pleasant things for children when they do what we want them to do. So we praise them, we give them treats and privileges, etc. Similarly, if we don't want to see these patterns repeating and routines becoming habitual, then we may use less pleasant ways of responding. So facial expressions, words, tones of voices, removal of privileges, etc., etc., in the hope that children would get the message and they would do more of what we like and less of what we don't like. Now, I would say for the majority of children in our societies, that model may work perfectly adequately. But what research has shown us, and certainly experience is now teaching us, is this is not good enough for the children and young people who worry us. So now we're much more interested in changing the model so that we now have much more emphasis on the antecedents, what precedes, what leads up to, what contributes to behaviours, and much less reliance on how we respond after behaviours. And really that makes a whole lot of sense because our traditional model really does very little to teach our youngsters what are the things that upset them, distress them, make them become emotional, and help them to understand that so that they learn what they can do rather than activate the old behaviour patterns that they have. It does nothing for that. It's all short-term fix. There's no eye on the longer-term outcomes, etc. So we're now much more focused on what we can do to predict behaviours that are likely to happen, therefore what we can put in place to prevent them from happening, rather than have to rely on how we respond after they happen. Hope I'm making this clear enough. And added to that is this business of self-regulation, because the more we help these youngsters to regulate their thoughts, their emotions, their memories, etc., the better they get at communicating their needs in socially acceptable ways, so they don't have to rely on the behaviours that make it difficult for them to fit in our societies and groups and so on. So, changing model for changing times. Now, the type of youngster who's likely to respond perfectly well to the first model is what I'll call the child A's. Most of us are child A's, and we're the lucky folks. Child A's are the lucky children because they tend to be born into circumstances where they are cared for, they have the chance to form good enough social attachment to other human beings, they've experienced a style of parenting which is conducive to helping them to learn these basic skills. And all in all, the development of self-regulation for them tends to be easy, automatic, and instinctively shared by the carers who are in charge of them. Generally, too, they're neurologically intact. It's as good as we would hope it to be for these children. So most of us probably would have come under the heading of child A at some point in the past. And if you think about it today, now I can't actually see any of you apart from the Creative Mornings team, but I'm assuming that you're all sitting out there demonstrating good, mature self-regulation. Now, there's something working in your brains right now, in a part of your brain, which is helping you to match your behaviors to the context that you find yourselves in. You're using self-control. It's nothing that I'm doing to bring about the demeanors, the ways that you're responding to the context you find yourselves in. So that's a demonstration of mature self-regulation. Everyone's heads are full of thoughts and worries and thinking ahead to what we might be doing over the spring bank, not the spring bank, but the bank holiday weekend. So our heads are buzzing with all of that. And yet, as mature, well-regulated adults, we have the skill of setting that to one side and coming up with the kind of behaviours that are expected of us. So we do okay in life. The ability to self-regulate is fundamental to success in life. Without it, life is jolly hard. And we are the successes in life. We've made it. We've got the ability to do all of this stuff. And we need to do something to reach out to youngsters who didn't get the kind of start in life that child A's have got. And we know that we have worrying numbers of children and young people in our societies now who struggle with weak self-regulation. And I'll not read through all the categories here, time doesn't allow, but we're talking about the youngsters for whom the early start in life might have caused an element of neurological impairment, which I'll come back to a little shortly. The children who have had an unfortunate experience with how they attach to another human being back in their very young childhood days, children who live with ongoing trauma, etc. These are the children and young people who worry us, because at the time in their lives when their brain should have been developing the ability to self-regulate, the chances are their little brains were very busy adapting and preparing themselves for the context that they found themselves in. Now, when I was taught as a teacher many, many years ago now, none of the scientific knowledge was available to us. So basically, we were taught that children who were disadvantaged in their very young days really were goosed. We couldn't do a great deal about it because we believed that human brains were hardwired for life under the age of 5. And there was very little we could do to help them around that. Now we know quite different from that now. So let's hope we've got time to get into some of it. I would suggest that we all need to now buy into the vision for all children. And that's the vision that's set out here, so that all children, no matter what start they have in life, eventually develop mature self-regulation so that they can learn to organize and control their thoughts, their emotions, their internal states, and their memories, so that they can take meaningful action in pursuit of the goals, the personal goals that may be set in front of them. In a nutshell, what we're after is what we're able to do. The ability to self-regulate means that we have got the ability to control all of this stuff that I'm talking about, and also to stop doing something at the wrong time because we just know it's the wrong thing to do. And in turn, we've got the ability to do the right thing, even if we actually don't want to do it. Now, that's a very useful skill to have. We weren't born with that, though. That's the very interesting thing. Back under the age of about 18 months, none of us was able to self-regulate. We acted on impulse. We were driven by our feelings. We hadn't learned the rules of society, and no one got cross with us because adults know by instinct that at that age we're not socially appropriate. So there's a wee chap in the museum art gallery with his mum, and he spots a desirable object, which he then responds to as appropriately as a small child would. Mum roars and laughs. If she took her son at the age of 14 round the same art gallery and he took the same action, Mum would not find it so funny. But at that age, she knows he hasn't got it. He hasn't learned good self-regulation. Weak self-regulation is all about not being able to delay impulses, to seek instant gratification. And I think that picture reflects a lot of us on a Friday night anyway, when self-regulation goes out the window. So at that age, children and youngsters rely entirely on external regulation by an adult. The capacity to self-regulate hasn't started to develop. So in this little chap's case, along will come an attuned adult who will see him and go, come on, out of the fridge, pick him up, move him on and shut the fridge door. And that's fine at that age. What is not fine is when we've got youngsters at the age of 15, 16, 17, who only manage to behave appropriately because of adults' external regulation around them. So we really need to get into this in a bit more detail. Now, I've only got time to give you the briefest insight into some of the basic parts of the human brain and how all this matters in terms of self-regulation. So stand by, get on your skateboards, and I'll try and make this as clear as I can. There's a very simple diagram of the human brain. The area where our self-regulation, our executive functions reside, is the front part of the neocortex. It's labeled there for us, the prefrontal cortex. Now, just so you understand, and apologies to people who know loads about this, but at least if we've all got a basic understanding, it's all we need. The human brain begins to form about 10 days after conception. Millions and billions of neurons form in a human brain. On their own and unconnected, they're no use. They're only useful when they join up with other neurons. Little synapses grow out of neurons, cling on to other neurons until pathways form. And as pathways form, electrical impulses can travel round, and a child can then learn something. Now, we know that some of these pathways are already formed before birth, but we also know that at birth, there are millions and billions of spare neurons waiting for life experiences to trigger those neurons into joining up with other neurons to form useful pathways. So we already know that things like biology, genetics, the circumstances of the mother's lifestyle may have an effect on a developing baby's brain. But we also know that at birth, the human brain is the only organ which is not complete and set for life. The human brain is capable of huge development, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. And contrary to what I was taught many years ago, that development is not over by the age of 5. Indeed, the potential for the prefrontal cortex to continue developing lasts into the early 20s. So for anyone who's got a young person from babyhood up to the early 20s with under their wing in some capacity, there is potential within that brain to reconfigure, to develop new pathways and so on. So right now, if I was able to brain scan all of you folks, I would see lots of electrical activity going on in your prefrontal cortex, because it's that part of the brain that allows you to make decisions and make plans, to control your impulses. Without going through it all in detail, that's where we have the capacity to read body language, read facial expressions. It's where our working memory is stored, etc. So it's a really important part of the brain, and you're using it right now because yours is very active. We know from brain scans that children who've been through lots of trauma and lots of disadvantage are likely to have less electrical activity going on up there. much more activity in another part of their brain. So I need to make connections for you. That's the prefrontal cortex. The other part to pay heed to is the amygdala, which lives in the limbic brain. Think of the amygdala as the guard dog, and that's its function. The function of the amygdala is to sit and check out the messages that are brought in via the senses. All the information we get out from our outside environment comes in via our senses, hearing, sight, smell, and so on. So these messages are brought in, the amygdala checks them out. If the amygdala is happy with them, and the amygdala isn't nervous, anxious, stressed, angry, or whatever, it sends an electrical impulse up into the prefrontal cortex, which then performs one of the functions that are listed there. That's good news. However, if the amygdala doesn't like a message and it stresses this person, makes them anxious, nervous, whatever, then it will send the message back down the way into the brain stem. Now, the brain stem is designed for one purpose only, and that's to protect our survival. It can't think. It doesn't have that capacity. It's in charge of things we've no control over anyway. Blood pressure, heart rate, chemical balance in our bodies, and so on. So if the amygdala sends the brainstem a message, it's as if the brainstem says, okay, I get the message, we've got a problem here. Now the brainstem's not able to decide, is it the piece of work that my teacher's just given me? Or is it someone coming down the path with a knife being held to me? It can't rationalize like that. It simply knows there's a problem. And to keep this person safe, it then initiates the fight, flight, freeze, or flock response, which is most linked to teenagers. And then the primitive brain drags blood supply from the top part, from the prefrontal cortex, to get it to the heart, so that this person is prepared to either fight back, to take flight, or to freeze, which might mean pulling a jacket up over a head, going under the table, climbing back into bed and putting the duvet over, whatever. The brainstem will take charge at a time of stressful experience and probably direct the person to take one of these reactions. So for the children and young people we worry about, that will be a well-trodden path for them. So the challenge is on for all of us. How do we encourage better activity in the prefrontal cortex so that the amygdala stops activating the primitive reptilian brainstem as much as it does? Now, the good news is the way it's done is actually very simple. And if I can push on a little, we need to think about what we actually do when we're faced with something that we may find hard to do, stressful, scary, something that's a big deal for us. If we were all in a room together just now, I might decide to pick on a few people and ask them to think of a song to sing, or perhaps a dance to demonstrate for us, which for most people would be a big deal, a bit scary, might be a bit risky. You could possibly look a twit doing something like that. And if I remember back, I think I put Matt through this experience at one time in the past. But of course, can't do that just now. But think about it when you leave here this morning, because how we cope with something that's stressful to us is we activate a mind tool, which is nothing more sophisticated than a voice in our heads. We use self-directed self-talk. We talk to ourselves. We soothe ourselves. We ask ourselves questions. So, for example, if I had asked someone to sing a song, that person's likely to go, oh no, I don't want to sing in front of everybody. I can't sing. Oh, but I'm going to have to. What song do I know? Now, our working memories are stuffed full of songs, but at a moment of stress, Someone might find it hard to retrieve a song to be able to sing. However, as well-regulated adults, we're most unlikely to take the fight, flight, freeze, well, maybe the freeze response. We're likely to sit, think it through, and come up with a strategy, come up with a song, come up with whatever it is. And the way we manage that is we talk to ourselves in our heads. So we've got a voice in our heads. The young people we're worried about don't have that voice. We also activate a pathway in our prefrontal cortexes. All of us as mature, successful, well-regulated adults have this bit of hardwiring in our prefrontal cortex. It's about setting goals, predicting difficulties, making plans, carrying those plans out, and then reviewing them. So I'll give you a tiny example, if I can think off the top of my head. Well, some of the young people I'm working with at the moment, how I'm using their difficulties and their stressors to try and help them develop this pathway in their brains. I'm supporting some carers just now who've got a wee boy who doesn't cope well with a good number of stressful situations. One of the ones that's getting him into most bother is he can't cope if he doesn't win playing a game. And if he doesn't win or his team doesn't win, he will have an episode of very distressed behavior, which will result in him lashing out at other children, hitting adults, floods of tears and all sorts. So the way that we would try and help him to develop a better way of coping with this is to use this cycle and to start with the review, to just say to him, once he's settled, that didn't go well on the field today, did it? That was hard for you when you didn't win the game. Then we would look at the goal. So the next time you go to play a game like that, then we would jump to predict. How do you think that's going to go? Is that going to be hard for you? Is that going to be a big deal? Because we need children to do what we do, which is to visualize themselves in that situation again, to be able to assess it so that they can say, yeah, that's hard, I don't like that. So that we can then say, right, so we need to make a plan then. What could we do? What could you try? What might work? So we try and help these children to think strategically, not in the heat of the moment, but when they're calm, to work out for the next time that this goal, this stressor comes along, how could they do it differently? We would then let them do it to then be able to review it again. So that, let's say this child has a game of football, maybe it doesn't go any better, we would still review it and say, so how did it go? That didn't work out, that didn't go so well. Okay, so the next time, and then we're back into the cycle. However, if the planning and the doing of the plan does make something go more smoothly, the review would be, wow, well done, that was much better. And gradually we begin to teach children the skills of a mature adult, which is to be able to identify their stressors, think them through, work out another strategy, put it into action while not engaging in behaviours that would take them away from that, with an opportunity then to review it. And it's only through practice, being coached by adults externally, that these children have any chance to develop this neural pathway, which we activate it umpteen times a day without realizing that we perhaps set them off into their futures with a bit more resilience, so that when the stressors that are particular stressors for them come along, they've got the wherewithal to control the impulse, just to put a moment between the thought, the emotion, and what they're likely to do, and to work out what they might be able to do that could bring them a better outcome. We're trying hard to teach them to get their needs met, but in ways that are socially acceptable. I work a lot in schools, and so often the source of the problem or the stressor is the fact that they can't do the work, especially in high schools. But for teenagers to have the strength to put their hands up and say, excuse me, I'm stuck, or this is too hard for me, a lot of teenagers would find that impossible. So they, especially the ones we worry about, just activate their old habits. So they tell the teacher to F off, say the work's boring, they throw the jotter over their heads, or they just disrupt everyone, or they storm out. So they get their needs met to avoid the piece of work which they feel they can't do, but they do it in ways that just land them in more bother. So the challenge is on for all of us to see if we can help youngsters by working around this cycle, which is exactly what we do without realizing. And perhaps if you're more conscious of it, if you're facing a stressor in your life, then you know to set it as a goal, predict how's it going to go, what's going to be hard about it, so that you then work out in advance and so on, which is exactly what we try to do with youngsters. Now, I'm going to have to draw to a close very quickly, but I know you won't be able to read this slide, but if anyone would like a copy of the scripted language that we rely heavily on for this approach to try and coach youngsters around this review, go, predict, plan, do, etc., then I'm more than happy to send it through to you or to pass it to Isabel and she'll make it available. I know you can't read this, but at one glance, I hope you can see that each bit of language is short. We talk far too much to these youngsters. Adult voices stress them. They agitate their amygdalas. Past experiences have taught them that adult voices can spell trouble. So we need to watch our style of communication, reduce our language down, use the same phrases regularly, in the hope that as the words come out of adult mouths, they go into children's ears, and to begin with, children will speak them out with adults, and eventually, fingers crossed, they internalize them so that they then have their own self-directed self-talk, that mind tool which they're going to need to make it in that outside world there where life can be tough for the children who've not had the best starts in life. So I'm terribly conscious of time. Can I just leave you finally with an extract from a poem that kind of sums a lot of this up for me? We've now got new knowledge, we've got new understandings. We need to challenge our old ways of responding to negative, unwanted patterns of behavior, because they do nothing to help our young people to learn long-term how to develop better skills and understandings. This poem was written, well, it's an extract from it, written a number of years ago, but it's ever more true. We are guilty of many errors and many faults, but our worst crime is abandoning the children, neglecting the fountain of life. Many things we need can wait. The child cannot. Right now is the time his bones are being formed, his blood is being made, and his senses are being developed. To him we cannot answer tomorrow. His name is today. And that kind of sums it up for me. We've got the knowledge. Children's lives go whizzing past in no time. If you have an opportunity, have a go at some of this with children. It's conceptually very easy. Sometimes it's procedurally difficult to do because it takes a bit of changing of thinking and so on. So that's all I've got time for. I hope some people have found something interesting and useful in all of that.
Morag. Everyone, please join me in giving virtual claps to the wonderful Morag. Woo! You might not have seen that before, Morag. This is just a thing we do. That was absolutely fascinating. I completely got lost in what you were talking about. And from the chat window, you've got such a great response. So from the whole of the Creative Mornings Edinburgh community, a huge thank you for that talk. It was absolutely brilliant.
You're most welcome.
So Morag, we'll just jump straight in. So this question comes from Claire in the chat, who says, you've touched on this a little, but what's your view on nature versus nurture? How much of our behavior are we born with versus learnt in early years?
I've come to believe it's a combination. Nature, early start plays their part, and there is some research beginning to come out now, or some early outcomes of research, which is beginning to suggest that environment, nurture may in fact play a bigger part in how we shape up a young person, but that's yet to be proven. I just have seen such remarkable improvements in young people if adult teams around them, parent, carer, school, community, etc., get in the boat and row in the same direction, then we begin to reshape brains that were perhaps not set on the best course. So yeah, a combination at the very least.
I love that. Get in a boat and row in the same direction. I just feel like you're full of inspirational quotes, Morag. Your next question comes from Claire Watson, a different Claire. Good morning, Claire Watson. So what is the biggest misunderstanding that adults, teachers, schools have? And if you could change it, and you could just click your fingers and change it, I've completely muddled up the way she's phrased that. I can start again. What is the biggest misunderstanding that adults, teachers, schools have that if you could change it, if you could click your fingers and change it, what does that look like?
Gosh, it's hard work. I spend whole days with whole big staff teams trying to just turn, it's like moving an ocean liner in a slightly different direction. And for me, it's about mindsets. Children who are challenging can de-skill teachers and staff teams, and very much then believe that the problems are located within the child. So if we remove the child, we remove the problem. And if I could help people to see that it's the context around the child plays such a big part in how they perform or how they respond. So I guess it would be that, it would be helping people to see change starts with adults. Young people and children cannot change their behavior routines unless we do something to bring about that change. So it's adults looking to themselves. When adults change their thoughts, their beliefs, and their approaches, everything changes. But the more fraught things get, sometimes the more adults cling on to this traditional model around behavior, which is still being taught in teacher training colleges.
So this actually links onto our next question. So can you talk a little bit about what approaches are currently being used in schools across Scotland and how much things have progressed since you started on your journey?
Yeah, things are progressing quickly in lots of areas. The government is driving the positive relationships, positive behaviour policies in this direction. But there's tension in the air around staff teams who may still be looking for consistent consequences, so that a child who swears in a class, they would expect that child to be treated exactly the same as all other children, that's fair and that makes us consistent. But the government's message is consistency is about consistently meeting every child's needs. So it makes utterly no sense. You know, if school gets word that that child's father was taken away by the police at 1 o'clock in the morning and that child's had very little sleep, then why would you respond to tricky behaviours from that child as you would for a child whose life's just dadding along quite smoothly? So there is helpful stuff coming from above.